to draw us close to Him, to nourish us, to sustain us, to give us Him in the form of bread and wine. Why bread and wine? Why did Jesus choose a meal to represent Himself in the world today? Well, first of all, the meal is the most intimate thing you could do with your friends, your disciple, your family. To sit, to recline at the table with those was to share your whole self. There was nothing more profound, nothing more intimate than sharing of the same bread, biting of the same bread, and drinking from the same cup. You know, at that moment, you were telling the others, hey, I am part of you. You are part of me. That's one of the reasons why Jesus chose to give us a meal, bread, wine, as part of showing His presence. But you know, as Catholics, we know that it is in the form of bread and wine. But the substance, what we're actually receiving, is not bread and wine. You see, when the priest prays over and asks for the Holy Spirit to be upon the bread and the wine, the offerings, the ordinary things that we offer to God, when he prays the epiclesis, the praying of the Holy Spirit, that moment, the bread is no longer bread. It is in the form of bread, but the substance, what we actually receive, is the body, the blood, the soul, and the divinity of Christ. It is not a symbol of Jesus. It is not just a memory of Jesus just because Jesus did it. It is actually the body and blood of Christ. When we receive the Eucharist, we're actually receiving God. God would be so vulnerable, so humble to give Himself to us in the form of bread and wine. Like a lamb that's gone to slaughter, at the mercy of those who shear, those who are killing that lamb. So Jesus gives Himself every time in the bread. You know, we can receive the bread and the Eucharist. We can receive His body, blood, soul, divinity. But also we can, because God is so vulnerable, we can abuse of that. When we don't receive Jesus, when we're in good standing with the Lord, when we have mortal sin. I've seen people even at schools where I've had to chase students who take the Eucharist because of their lack of knowledge very often. And they take the Eucharist and they put it in their pocket, and my heart breaks. My heart screams, my soul screams, because I'm thinking, don't you just realize what you just did there? That is God. God. But this is the beauty of our God, you see, that He allows Himself to become that vulnerable as to possibly being put in the pocket of a student. Now, that's absolutely wrong, and it breaks my heart, as I said, when people don't understand the power of the Eucharist. But also, how amazing that God would become that vulnerable so that He could enter into our hearts and our lives. That is the real presence of God. Whether you see it, whether you believe it, whether you understand it, whether you're conscious of it or not, every time you go to Mass, you are receiving God. And as you receive God, you become what you eat. You're receiving holiness. You're receiving strength. You're receiving justice. You're receiving peace personified. And then, as you do that, that's what you become if you allow God. Once I was at a university. I was studying for my degree, for one of the degrees I was studying, and I used to go to the chapel. Now, the reason why I used to go to the chapel was to pray, because I used to go and sit. But I also used to take my books to study there in the chapel, because it was a quiet place and I just wanted to be around Jesus. And one day I was sitting in this chapel and I sort of had a revelation, a vision of the Eucharist. You see, I was sitting there was the Eucharist right there in front of us, but in the chapel, in the university chapel, there were students there having a little conversation. There were another 2 students praying together. There were a few students just there studying, And there were other students even asleep there in the silence of the chapel. And I was there just praying at this point. And as I was praying, I opened my eyes, and again in my imagination, as a vision, I don't know whatever you call it, I see gold dust coming out of the tabernacle. It's just this beautiful fine gold dust that made its way and started coming out of the tabernacle, out of the presence of the Eucharist, and it started to fill the whole chapel. And as I looked around, I could see this fine dust, gold dust, and the people who were having this conversation, they were breathing in this fine dust. And those who were studying, they too were breathing in this fine dust. They weren't aware of it. Those who were praying were breathing in the fine dust. Those who were asleep as well were breathing in the fine dust, the gold dust, and myself too. You see, that showed me something so beautiful that day, that God's presence is there in His body, blood, soul, divinity. Even as we go to times of adoration and we worship God in the Eucharist, God changes us. He transforms us by His presence alone. As we breathe in His presence, whether we're asleep, we're awake, whether we're having a spiritual conversation, or whether we're studying. When we're in the presence of God, the presence of the Eucharist, we cannot walk out the same. We cannot. You see, this is the power of the Eucharist. And this is why online Mass, I love celebrating this online Mass. But please, the minute you get a chance, go to the Eucharist. Go breathe in the presence of God. Go and receive the body, blood, soul, divinity, because you will be transformed. You will be changed. Go to Jesus. Let Him give you strength and joy. And even in this Mass, we will have spiritual communion. And those of you who are in lockdown, I understand. God is able to supply your every need. But long for the Eucharist. Long for Jesus. Jesus, I thank you so much for giving us your body, blood, soul, divinity, your presence, your real presence in the form of bread and wine.